Air salt. Okay. I came back with caramels on my desk. Think I'll leave more often. Sorry about that. We'll take that out of Jason's time. So we're just gonna roll on here. Thank you to the witnesses. We got Hope Allen, Director of Student Assessment, Arkansas Department of Education. Wesley Davis, Mathematics Teacher, Cabot High School. Heather Rainbolt, Testing Coordinator, Little Rock Central High School, that I met when I was touring Little Rock Central the other day, and she was giving the PART test, I believe. Dr. Richard Phelps, Testing Scholar and Economist, and Dr. Denise Airola, Director, Office of Innovation for Education, University of Arkansas. So this is a big panel, we get that, but we just also important. So we're going to go until the end of the day, which is about 2.5 hours, without a break. Anybody needs a break, just get up and take it on your own. No one will care. So why don't we start out with our 5-minute openings. We'll start with Hope Allen, and we'll go right down 5 minutes each, and then we'll ask our questions. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor and panel, for being here today. I know these are long days, and we appreciate your time here. My name is Hope Allen. I am Director of Student Assessment for the state of Arkansas. And I just want to walk you through kind of the requirements for testing. I know there's a lot of question about what does No Child Left Behind require, what does Arkansas require. I also want to talk to you a bit about the first year of implementation of online testing. I know we hear a lot about that. And then lastly, just some recommendations that I have moving forward from my office, how we can better support Arkansas next year as we move in this process. So the first thing I want to do is just refer you to the handouts that I gave you. If you look on page 5, there's a chart that says Arkansas required tests by grade. Arkansas requires, because of No Child Left Behind, we have federal requirements and we have Arkansas requirements that are put in by state law. So in kindergarten, we have a screener that takes about 10 minutes per student. At grades 1 and 2, we require the Iowa Assessment of Basic Skills. Those two are by state law. Those two are required by state law. Then you get to grades 3 through 12. And what federal No Child Left Behind says is that we must administer ELA and mathematics once a year in grades 3 through 8 every year. We also must administer a science assessment once in the grade bands 3 through 5 and once in the grade bands 6 through 8. Then you get into the high school. What's required at the high school is once in grade bands 9 through 12, we must administer a math and English and math, English, and science exams. So that's what's required by state and federal law. State law also requires that we participate in the NAEP assessment that happens at grades 4 and 8. That is a sampling of students across the state. It's not every 4th and 8th grader, and not every 4th and 8th grader takes the entire test. They take a sampling of the whole entire NAEP test. Then you have another state law that is the College and Career Readiness Law that requires us to administer a College and Career Readiness assessment at grades 8 and 10. Currently, we use Explore at grade 8 and Plan or PSAT, depending on what the school chooses at grade 10. We are making a change for next year that schools may choose to use the PARC assessment as their College and Career Readiness measure if they would like to, instead of giving the Plan, PSAT, or Explore. That was a district choice, and we had districts, superintendents let us know what they would like to do for that. So those are the requirements. We also have an optional VUAA, which is the universal ACT that schools may participate in if they would like to. So our schools can give the ACT to all their 11th graders if they choose to do that. And then lastly, we did this year make 11th grade ELA and Algebra 2 optional. So some schools will say we tested 11th grade ELA and Algebra 2. That was not required by the State Department. At the high school, we required 9th and 10th grade ELA to be tested, and we required Algebra 1 and Geometry to be tested. So those are your federal and state requirements. If I speak to just quickly what's the difference, you've heard a lot about criterion reference and norm reference testing, and I think our vendors today did a great job of explaining kind of what their test do in those regards. And the vendors they each have a test that has its pros and its cons. They all do. And Arkansas actually has a state contract with 5 out of the 6 vendors that you heard speak today in some regard. So we do currently work with many of the vendors that you spoke with in some capacity on the state level. When you hear about online, the biggest thing my office has heard about online testing, moving to PARCC testing this year, is really the transition to online. And many of you have spoke about that this morning. That has been a undertaking for our schools, to say the least. Looking at devices, looking at bandwidth, all of those things have been something that our schools have had to look at and have had challenges within that. Yes, we've worked with the Pearson. They're our vendor for the PARCC assessment, and there are some challenges there as well, but they also have offered customer service to us and worked through the problems that we've had across the state. I would say overall, I've received positive feedback from students and from schools. They like the online testing. Students are more engaged whenever they're able to get online and test. I would agree completely that there's been some glitches that we want to work through, and they want to better support our schools next year. All schools in the state of Arkansas were offered the opportunity to apply for a waiver in August of this year. Excuse me, August of 2014 for this year's administration. Every waiver that was brought to us was granted. So we're trying to work with schools and not put a burden on them that they could not meet by moving fully to online testing. If you consider Arkansas went from 0% online last year to almost 95% online this year, that's a huge undertaking. And that speaks very highly to our schools and what they were able to do. Again, there are pros and cons with that, and there are challenges with that. The last thing I'd just like to mention is the recommendations coming out of my office. We have recognized that our DTCs have worked extremely hard this year, and our superintendents have as well. And we want to hear from them, so we formed a panel of our district testing coordinators that we will be pulling them together in June, the 1st of June, and they're going to be giving feedback to the State Department. This panel is from across the state. I've got at least 3 representatives from each of the 5 regions across our state to represent schools that were online, schools that were paper, large schools, small schools. And within that process, we hope to gain some insight as to how we can better support schools, what worked, what didn't work, what needs to be tweaked in the manual, what needs to be done differently from the State Department so that we can better support schools. We can also look at scheduling. A lot of the problems that we're hearing are around scheduling, and I can speak to more of that if you have questions about that. And then also, as you heard Laura say earlier, for the PARCC assessment, we are going to shorten that window, collapse it down into one, so that the burden is not on schools to test in 2 separate windows. Thank you.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you for having me here today. My name is Wes Davis, and I'm a mathematics teacher at Cabot High School. I'm an AP exam grader and an AP exam writer for College Board. And my most interesting assignment lately has been the PARCC Math Exam Item Review Committee, where I serve on a committee to look at all the PARCC assessment items in mathematics from Algebra 1 through Algebra 2. And we review the items for mathematics content and doability, as we'll call it. We work closely with Pearson, who is the test writers, and ETS supports them. I'm here in case you have any questions about the PARCC itself, since I know the routine pretty well, since we sat through a whole week of 3 weeks of looking at items and how they are developed, who looks at those items with me, and what their qualifications are. I have no formal presentation for the committee here today, and no papers to pass out to you. I am just here in case you have questions about the PARCC itself. Thank you.
Quick question. Are you also employed by Pearson, or do you do it on a voluntary basis?
I am not employed by Pearson. I have my expenses reimbursed by Pearson, but I am not employed by Pearson at all.
You just volunteer to
Yes, sir.
out. Ms. Rainbolt.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Heather Rainbolt. I'm a parent of a graduate of Parkview High School in the Little Rock School District, as well as 2 children in North Little Rock, and a former employer of the ADE. And for the past 6 years, I've been the testing coordinator at Little Rock Central High School. I'm speaking to you today not only as a testing coordinator, but also as the parent of students who experienced testing on every level, including the PARC pilot, and this year the PARC online assessments, the practice tests, the PBA, and the EOI, and as a testing coordinator. So from my perspective, if we take a look at testing, we need to consider the fact, which Ms. Allen has already said, they've addressed and understand that the 2 40-day windows is really impractical in its application. And that's really good to know, because the 2 40-day windows is completely disruptive to the learning environment, and it doesn't address districts that have highly mobile student populations. So as students move, they're not able to complete both portions of the test, which invalidates their scores and essentially wastes everybody's time. The performance-based test and the end-of-year test for each graded subject in 2 separate windows was excessive. And I guess if you're going to shorten the windows, do you know what that looks like yet? Okay. Because at this point, it's almost 9 weeks of testing, which is a problem because it violates the rules of the Arkansas policy, which says that the planned instructional time for each school day shouldn't average less than 6 hours per day or 30 hours per week, which makes it impossible to achieve that with the testing schedule as it currently exists. So PARC is supposed to test grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and do both of the windows, which created a new testing requirement for 9th and 10th grade and created the PBA in addition to the EOI assessment for all grades, which essentially doubled the amount of testing that we did, which is easily seen taxing on all the students. So students who were taking geometry and algebra had to take PBA and EOI, and in districts that chose to participate in the ACT, they were granted a waiver, but it's not a school choice, it's a district choice. So if you happen to be in a district that did not choose to participate in the ACT, you did not have the option of that waiver. And I believe the enrollment for the VUAA happens like early the previous year before they even knew that that was going to be an option. So if it's going to continue to be an option, it would seem like there would need to be some sort of mechanism to allow schools and districts that chose not to take advantage of the universal ACT at a district level so that they could have that option. So total tests for 3rd through 7th grade, they take 2 to 3 tests, which has doubled. There's also the ELDA assessment, which all ESL students have to take, which is another test. 8th grade took up to 5 tests this year. 9th through 12th grade took 12 mandatory tests this year, and 13 if they were ESL. And if they were enrolled in IB classes or AP classes, or chose to take the PSAT, then even more. So the battery of tests that we are currently subjecting our students to that are mandatory don't consider the AP tests that students take and the IB tests that students take. PSAT, which students can choose to take, and some districts choose to have that paid for. Other districts choose the plan, but that's also a test that these kids are subjected to, and another disruption to the learning environment. In addition to that, from my perspective at a high school, grades 10, 12, our 10th grade students are hammered with testing. They have to take a geometry test if they're enrolled in geometry. All 10th graders take biology in our district. They all have to take the plan test because that was the test that we chose. Many of our 10th graders take the PSAT test, and they all had to take the literacy test in 2 separate testing windows. So all of those students had to take all of those tests, and all of their teachers had to give all of those tests. So consider the amount of time that those students spent out of the classroom assessing the material that they were not able to be in the classroom to get. So they also discuss the norm reference part of the PARCC test, which, and I heard the people previously talk about how it's bragging rights, but I disagree. If we're going to go with Common Core, the point of that is to have a standardized set of standards nationally. If you can't see how your students are comparing to other students in other states, you really don't know how you're implementing the standards. So I would say that norm reference piece is a pretty integral part of it. PARCC says that they have that, but with currently approximately 10 states enrolled in PARCC, you're really not getting a meaningful result from that reference. So I would consider that a huge problem because you're not comparing apples to apples. We used to give the Iowa test to 9th graders, and I'm not advocating for more testing at all, but that is something that's used more widely and can give you a broader result for how you're doing. And I would say that that's something that should be considered.
Thank you for that. Dr. Phelps.
Hello, thanks for inviting me to Arkansas. I may seem like the non-Arkansas person out here, but my DNA's from here. Great-granddaddy Levi Phelps lived in Greensboro, Arkansas, which I think is right near Jonesboro. If anybody thinks they're related, let's talk afterwards. I'm speaking just from my notes. I submitted a slideshow, but I'm not speaking from that slideshow. It may be in your folders. I'm mostly distressed about the debate over testing these days and assessment policy these days. I think it's become very one-sided. And one reason for that is because the test development firms have become businesses, and there are a lot of advantages to having test development firms be businesses rather than what some of them used to be, essentially academic research parks. But one disadvantage is that some of the most protesting testing experts in the country can't talk. These days they have to sign gag orders, and that's standard practice for most corporations. They live in a competitive environment. You can't have your employees giving different points of view that will be attributed to the company. So we essentially have this huge population of experts who aren't involved in the public debate, and I think that skews the debate generally against testing. Occasionally, journalists, when they make any attempt to be to get another side to the testing story, they might go to the conservative think tanks, and those folk tend, though smart about a lot of things, tend not to know very much about testing. And we end up with a very one-sided conversation. Now, I know you had I consider your university's Department of Education reform essentially an outpost of the think tanks. You had a representative here last week. And I also noticed last week when I was watching on the computer that there was an extensive discussion of testing policy. And I wanted to address a few of the points that were raised then, because I think otherwise they'll just be left hanging. One is how standards matter, and standards matter because in standards-based testing, item writers queue on the standards. They'll queue very, very closely to the standards. They will use words that are in the standards, in the items. They will use, if there are parenthetical examples in the standards, they may use those examples. And they have to create a test item out of something, so might as well make it close to the standards. Now, I think that's a good thing. I think standards-based tests should be very closely aligned. But it means that when standards are coupled with assessments, they are very powerful. So standards do matter. Second, I think it was proposed last week that you purchase inexpensive nationally norm reference tests off the shelf, you'll save money, and it's a good thing that they're not aligned to your standards. Well, I would disagree with the latter point, but you have to keep in mind that when you use nationally norm reference test, you cannot use them for stakes. If you attach any stakes to them, you will be inviting a lawsuit, and I think you'll lose that lawsuit. The case law stems from Deborah P. versus Turlington, 1979 through 1984. That's when states quit using norm reference tests for high stakes, and they all converted to standards-based test development in the mid-1980s. Now, some may say, well, that's fine, just have norm reference tests, no stakes, and that's a good thing. But what you give up from research that I've been involved in is 2 grade levels of improved achievement. I've reviewed a few thousand studies on the effects of testing on student achievement. Through experiments, most of these studies show that when more frequent testing produces increased achievement in students, stakes attached to the testing produces increased achievement for students. Now, it's important that the stakes needn't be very high, but there have to be some stakes or the students don't take the test seriously. Many folks, education insiders, want you to look at Finland, where they say they don't test very much, but there are 20 other countries that are beating us on international tests, and most of them test a lot. They don't have high stakes tests annually. They have high stakes tests every few years, like at the end of upper secondary, the end of lower secondary, and their stakes are often very, very high. I don't think they have to be as high as they are, but there have to be stakes attached for the students to take the test seriously. Having norm reference tests as annual tests for diagnostic monitoring purposes, I think is a great idea. But you can't attach stakes to them. They have to be extra. Finally, oh, sorry, I'm running out of time. Well, the aversion to teaching to the test, I think, is a red herring. Teachers are supposed to teach to the test. If their standards aligned, that's what they're supposed to do. That's what they're legally and morally obligated to do. I think it just doesn't make any sense. It's absurd to say that teachers should teach away from the standards, or that tests should test something other than the standards, if they're standards-based tests. Well, I guess I only have time for one more point, but what you seem to be ending up with is, I think No Child Left Behind was a big mistake, and I think Common Core is just sort of continuing that mistake. I think most of the problems with Common Core are essentially just from carrying on No Child Left Behind. But as you say, it's sunk cost, and here we are. But a lot of the solutions offered by the companies seem to be hybrids. You'll hear them say, oh, our test is aligned to the standards. So, okay, so it's an achievement test and it's retrospective. Oh, but our test is highly predictive too. Okay, so it's an aptitude test and it has high predictive validity with what goes on in college, which is very different from what goes on in high school. Well, I don't think you can do both of those well. Hybrid tests, you're giving up something. A test that's both norm reference and criterion reference, it's not the best criterion reference test you could have or the best norm reference test you could have. You're giving up something. And the more mushy things get, I think the kids who suffer the most are the less advantaged kids. Kids who are grade levels ahead of everybody else, they're going to do better on anything. It's the kids near the bottom who need the most clarity who suffer from all this mush. That's my, oh, one more point? Sorry. One thing you can do that I think would be great is release your higher education institutions from the noose of having to take, but not being able to use their placement tests anymore, having to take the PARC assessment as the equivalent of their placement tests. I'd say if the PARCC is so great, if it's higher, deeper, richer, more rigorous and all that, then the kids are going to pass all the placement tests. So keep the placement tests in place. If PARCC is as great as they say it is, the kids will do well, and after a few years, the colleges will get rid of them themselves. But meanwhile, the placement tests are the barrier that keeps the world's best higher education system from all the mush in the K-12 system. Okay, sorry.
Doctor.
It's been a long day, and it's actually my first time today to listen in on any of this, and part of that is just because life is really busy, and there are a lot of things going on, and part of it was because when Hope invited me to come and talk about the PK2 survey that we did from the assessment task force, I wanted to come in here and kind of see things fresh with a fresh set of eyes, and I'm glad I did that. I have been in the state of Arkansas for 25 and a half years. It's the longest I've lived anywhere in my life. I'm the daughter of a Marine, and then I became the wife of a Marine. I've lived in 11 different states in the Union, and I spent 6 weeks living on board a ship in the Northwest Atlantic, and I've been a person who's been in many different states and gone from 4th grade standards in one state to 5th grade standards in another state, and obviously I've done enough in my life that I've survived that and actually done quite well with that. I say all of that because I think that history and process are really important, and as I was listening to your questions this morning, I was really thinking back to when I first started teaching in Arkansas in 1995 and 1996. And even earlier than that, I taught in California when my husband was stationed at Pendleton. And in California in the mid-'80s, we didn't have standards we had to follow. I remember asking my master teacher, so what's like the order of, what's the scope and sequence I'm supposed to teach? And she handed me this giant book of minimum competencies. And I looked at that thing and I went, oh my gosh, how do you teach all of this? And so it's really interesting to watch how history has kind of unfolded. And I hope that we will be attentive to what we've learned from the processes we've been through in the past. I say that, I've given you a set of materials, and I'm not going to go through those materials, but I realized there's a really good quote in here from Emerson that I pulled out when I do a lot of training. I've done a lot of professional development on the use of assessment scores and the use of data. And I pulled this after a while because it says, as to methods, there may be a million and then some, but principles are few. The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. The man who tries methods, ignoring principles, is sure to have trouble. When we started transitioning into the benchmark exam back in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, I was teaching and doing a curriculum supervision job. At the same time, I had duties in both areas. And people were popping up from everywhere saying, oh, this is how you do it. You take this item and you tear it apart like this. There were all these crazy methods out there for how to take the test apart so that you could then improve your test scores. And all of that comes about if we're not paying attention to those principles. And I was really struggling with what those principles were, and so I ended up going back to school. And that's how I ended up doing this job as the Director of Office of Innovation for Education. I wanted to know more about what that information meant to me as a teacher, but then also as a parent. I have 3 grown daughters who have been through the Arkansas public school system. I have a granddaughter who'll be there in 4.5 years. And I'm very, very vested in our system. And I'm thinking about these principles, and really, you heard from the vendors this morning, you're hearing from a very diverse group here, but I think we really need to focus on what are those principles that can guide us in this process. And a very wise person this weekend talked about, what do we do when our moral compass is challenged? Well, I would say that at this point in Arkansas public school history, our best practices, what is it that we revere as best practices in education, is being challenged. And usually when you're in a situation where you're being asked to change course or to give up on what you're doing, it's because you're hitting one of 3 things, or all of these 3 things together. You're either dealing with problems, pressures, or people. And when you get into that situation, you have to go back to those basic principles to help guide you. And when I think about those basic principles, what we did in the PK2 task force really mimics through that. So in the materials I had given you, we talked about how we reviewed the latest research on developmentally appropriate assessment for pre-K through grade 2 students. We reviewed the technical requirements necessary to support developmental appropriateness and to support the standards. We learned the principles for selection of developmentally appropriate assessments and intended use of scores from those assessments. And then we discussed the requirements. Those didn't come before everything else. Those came in after we talked through these basic principles. Then we looked at the requirements that the statutes and the rules have us follow. And then we talked to others about their current experiences with the assessment, and through that gathered additional information. And that additional information is being presented to the State Board on Friday, and you've got pieces of that through the survey. And the idea behind that is to really use those basic principles and to tap into those and to really focus on purpose. And what came out of that work is the incredible importance of purpose in assessment. And as I was listening this morning to the vendors, and I'll be very brief in summarizing this, my concern was that if you're not looking at the purpose of the assessment and what it is that the assessment is intended to do, you're not necessarily going to be making a decision that's going to be aligned with the use of the information. So there are some really basic principles for how to select assessments that need to be employed, and you have to be very aware of purpose. For pre-kindergarten through second grade, that purpose is different from grades 3 through 8, and for also those assessments that go on into the college readiness sphere. And I'm hoping that I wrote down in here, please ask me questions about that, because 5 minutes is not enough to talk about all that I got to learn in the past 11 years to answer my first questions when I was a teacher and somebody trying to lead curriculum and instruction and assessment. Thank you.
Thank you. And if there's anything that you want to submit that you don't get to today, if you'll submit it to us, we will post it on the website under your testimony. We're doing that routinely. Right, Anna Marie, and so people can go on and see that, and also we'll make sure that we get it to everybody on the council. So, and we are devouring a lot of the materials that people have given us. We're going to start with you, Jason. Or no, we'll start with Cindy this time. Cindy.
I received this. Can somebody tell me who?
That was from this.
Okay, that's okay. I wanted to check on where that came from, something else. Okay, we get so much, we're not sure where it's coming from, so I wanted to clarify that. Thank y'all for coming today. I appreciate it, and we have a lot to devour for sure. Miss Allen, I really like your name, and I want to ask you a couple of questions, and you went through this quickly because of your limited time, so I'm going to let you help me out with this. No Child Left Behind. I mean, from what you said, and I know I got this wrong, all they have to take in 3rd through 8th grade is one thing of science. That couldn't be right. So you're going to have to go over this again for me because I didn't get it all. Would you please briefly go what No Child Left Behind and Arkansas Standards and everything require once again for me?
Of course.
Thank you.
And let me just interrupt. There's a chart that she gave us.
I couldn't find it, so I'm sure it's in here.
Because I couldn't write down as fast as you were talking either. But there's a great chart that she provided us. It's right after that. I'll come over there and help you find it.
And can I just say one thing on the materials I did submit? On page 5 of the materials I submitted to you with the times and the tests that are required, there is a typo on the 9th and 10th grade ELA and Park Algebra 1 and Geometry. I just want to make sure we clear that up.
Thank you. Thank you.
The Algebra 1 test does not take 11.5 hours. It takes 5 hours and 20 minutes. That's the allotted time. The 9th and 10th grade Park ELA take 5 hours and 45 minutes. Algebra 1 and Geometry are allotted 5 hours and 20 minutes. I just want to clear that up, and then I'll answer the No Child Left Behind.
Okay, well, he helped me find that page, but I do know we've learned this morning the plan will no longer and the Explore will no longer be given, so
Right, so I want to mention one thing about No Child Left Behind, because you can see the chart there of what's required. What's also required is criterion referenced, that the test is aligned to your state standards. So that's one thing to keep in mind as we're looking at an assessment program that is going to be used for our accountability system. It must be aligned to the standards according to the feds. Now, if you're looking at Plan and Explore, yes, they are sunsetting those two assessments. We have been told by ACT that we can offer that next year, and we're giving that option to our schools. And that test meets the letter of the law for the college and career readiness assessment, which is a state law.
So you're saying it will not be given this coming year?
It will be given schools have the option to administer in 15-16. But
Okay.
after 15-16, I cannot say for sure if we will have that option or not.
Okay, well, the way he put it today, it sounded like it was gone. That affects me because I'm the one that gives it at my school. So I'm kind of interested in if we're given the Explore or not. The other thing that you also mentioned is that, let me look at my notes real quick. Okay, overall, and you can probably answer this though, is we have been told, is this correct, that we must do the park next year? It's already a done deal.
Right, so I've been asked that a lot, and the way that your contracts work with the State Department is your contract runs out on June 30th, and you sign a new contract on July 1, is the hope. At the moment, I have not signed any contracts. Our plan is to move forward with the park assessment unless I'm told otherwise.
Okay, thank you. Quick question, and of course I have not had time, Dr. Airola, to read all your information, but could you summarize, as y'all looked at our Common Core standards, or at the Common Core standards, the ones we're using, did you think it was appropriate for K through 2? I mean, I haven't had time to go through all this, so I don't know. What was y'all's?
Current assessments?
Yes.
So when we went through and surveyed, for this survey, we ended up with quite a few teachers who were able to fill out the survey. And overwhelmingly, to very quickly summarize, purpose is what came out of this. That at the pre-K through second grade level, teachers are very focused on, I need to know at the very beginning of the school year what my concerns are for each and every one of my students so that I can then know what to do instructionally to support them. That there were a lot of concerns about alignment, that our existing assessments aren't fully aligned to the standards they're expected to teach, and that does create some issues for them. It makes it very difficult because even though at the pre-K through second grade level, there isn't school level accountability attached to it, there is this heightened sense of concern about assessment because we have had high stakes accountability associated with other assessment scores. And so the pre-K through second grade teachers who were surveyed were very strong in saying, we really want any new assessment that we give to be developmentally appropriate to serve the purpose of helping us initially screen students to understand who has what needs so that we can do the best for them for the most amount of time. That was the biggest thing that came out of that.
Okay, thank you. Thank y'all.
Well, good afternoon. I know it's been a long day. Some of you have been here all day and listening in. I can appreciate what your work is, Ms. Allen. I know it's a big job, and thank you for doing that. I'm sure you have a lot of supervisors and people guiding you. Thank you for your work, writing assessment and volunteering that. And I know, Ms. Rainbolt, you've worked really hard to deliver and coordinate testing at a large high school, the Central High School. And looking at your resume, you have quite an extensive background with Washington University in St. Louis, and then I'm impressed with the Wharton School Business. And you've written several articles. I'm interested to know when you say it's important that we test what are in the standards, and any good teacher would know, that's why they're looking for those released items, what kind of questions are going to be on the test, because we know we want to prepare our children. I, for one, would not want to go take a test that I hadn't prepared for. But then I listened to your testimony and your comments about purpose. I really appreciate that, and what Emerson says, that we cannot allow the method to become the principal. How we deliver the instruction. We have to keep the main thing the main thing. So coupling all that together, and this is for anybody to answer, what direction do we go? Be specific about testing, what direction we need to go, and we need to think about cost. I mean, the biggest pie of the budget is testing, I think, and then it's textbooks, and then textbooks have gone away in a lot of things, and everything's left up to the teacher. So then again, we go back to, it's on the teacher, the classroom, the school. They're using their own money to go out and invest in things. Of course, we give them everything we can, because the money that we're spending it's involved with the testing and the computers, which I believe we have to have. So what do we do? We're looking to you all for the answers.
Did I turn that thing on? There we go. I'm jumping at this just because I have spent 11 years working with 4 different states, including Arkansas, on using assessment data and systems of assessment. And I think we need to think beyond, I know our purpose is to talk in terms of Common Core testing, but I think that in the profession of teaching, we have devalued our profession in terms of what we learn to do and what we need to do with our students. And so we've taken this idea that assessment is a way to inform us about our students' needs. It's a way to inform us about our own effectiveness in helping them to be learners. We've taken that and we've reduced it down to a single test. Now, there's a purpose for that test. We have to meet certain purposes, legally required purposes. The state summative test, if you go back to the beginning, it's so funny. I think back to 2001, when we first started, Arkansas was on that cutting edge. We were one of the first states to put 50% of our points on our tests in constructed response items. That was a huge thing. But the purpose behind doing that was to test students in a way that required them to go deeper in their thinking and to get teachers thinking differently, not to teach to the test, but in the words of W. James Popham, who's a psychometrician, to get what we call test-triggered clarity. The standards tell us what kids are supposed to, what we're supposed to help them know and be able to do at certain levels to reach some terminal goal, and in this case, college and career readiness. But to get them there, and as teachers, if we put together standards, we could put together 1 million standards. I've done curriculum development with mathematics people, science people, foreign language, language arts, and social studies, and trying to get a room full of teachers in one district to agree to a reasonable set of standards is impossible. So we always end up with more than we can possibly do, right? And that was one of the beauties of Common Core. We were supposed to be going deeper and not wider. But regardless of its Common Core, Arkansas standards, you have a system of assessment to help you understand where kids are in that process. And you can't rely on a state summative assessment to do that. So you have to have other components of the system within. And so what we're doing with these interim assessments gives us these benchmarks during the year. But really, as a teacher, you're developing moment-by-moment assessments, your observations, these other tools, those are of value as well. And these other assessments become ways to benchmark how well that looks from a group level, and also to communicate some information to the parent in general about the student themselves. So we need to think more in terms of a system of assessment and what the purpose of each of those components are, instead of focusing all of our eggs on a state summative assessment, which, unless you want it to be very long with lots of items, is never going to give you all the information you need to direct your instruction. It's just not designed for that. Not at the cost that we can all afford.
Can I speak to that question? I think as a state assessment program, whatever we go with, it needs to address the standards. I think that is critically important for our teachers. It's very unfair to hold me accountable to something that I'm not teaching in my classroom. So I think it's imperative, whatever direction we go, that we maintain an assessment that addresses our standards, that informs our teachers of what they're doing directly related to those standards that we're asking them to teach. I think every vendor, like we heard from this morning, they all have a diagnostic program, they all have a formative program, and those are great, and they serve very valuable purposes in our schools. Several of you guys are using them in your schools. But every school is different, and so I don't think every diagnostic program or formative assessment program is the same for every school. It doesn't look the same because kids are different in those schools. And so personally, from a state level, I think having a good quality summative assessment that maintains the quality of the standards, that tests writing, that tests critical thinking and mathematics, that gives us back quality data in a timely manner is very, very important, and then allow our schools the freedom to use what they want for their diagnostic, for their formative, to drive that instruction on a daily basis.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Two things. If you're undecided, or there's a lot of different feelings about where you should go, I think you have to keep your contractors on a short leash, very short contracts, until things sort of clear up for you. I know they hate that, and it'll cost you more money because they save money with longer contracts, but I think that's what you have to do. If you were to decide that you really want to get away from the Common Core standards, at this point, I guess you have to pick your battles, and I'd say, the early grade standards are kind of okay. It's the upper grade standards, at least in math, that I think are awful, and I would say go for that. Change that first, and let the primary and middle school, let the primary grades alone for a while.
Thank you all.
Kayla?
After looking at that list, I mean, we do a lot of testing that's required in the state of Arkansas. I know testing is important. I'm a teacher, and I understand it's important. Myself, I was never really great at taking a standardized test. It just wasn't my thing. The timed part was not good for me. And I know a lot of students that way. So basing, everything on one test, to me, just kind of goes against everything I believe. I think that our students are very important, and where they're at is where we need to be thinking about, and where we need to take them, and how are we going to get there. And I'm not really sure that this kind of test is going to get us there. So what are your thoughts about this kind of test, and is it really going to show us where our kids are, what their weaknesses are, and how we can move them forward? Because I'm really concerned about what's my students doing and not how they compare to this state over here and this state over here, because honestly that really doesn't bother me at all.
And that's why I would say first and foremost, my first goal is to maintain an assessment that's aligned to the standards. Because if our assessment, no matter what it is aligned to the standards, then yes, we can report back your students in your grade at your school perform well on this set of standards. They don't perform well on this set of standards. Maybe they're weak in writing. So that assessment, whatever we use, has to have a wider range of question types. It has to have a wider range of depth of knowledge levels. So for the PARCC assessment we currently have and our benchmark previous has a range of question types. So there's some questions that for the math test are as simple as what's 57 divided by 8? And type the answer in, non-calculator question, as simple as that. Then there's other questions that take you up to a higher depth of knowledge that require students to use the standard of division, but somehow apply that to a practice or some kind of worded type problem. So think if we maintain a test that gives us that type of information where students, they not only have multiple choice questions and short answer questions, but they have an opportunity to show their depth of knowledge by writing, by answering open response questions, then we are able to give back more data to schools and teachers. One of the reasons that we get scores back late, a lot of the companies today spoke about how quickly we can get results back. You can get results back very quickly on a multiple choice test. Anything that can be machine scored very quickly, because that doesn't take any time to put in a computer system. If you take it on the computer, I can score it within a matter of seconds. What takes time to score is writing and open response questions for mathematics. So if we want to maintain that with our students, if we want our students to explain their reasoning, if we want our students to write more than just, give me a letter to your principal about why we should reinstate pep rallies on Friday, which sometimes could be a writing prompt, but more of a prompt where they have to take two texts and analyze them and use evidence. If we want to maintain that standard of writing for our students, then it's going to take longer to get our results back, and that's where also your additional cost comes in.
But what about the gentleman, I can't remember his name, Montgomery? He said that with the Aspire test, it was a 20 to 30 day turnaround, and he said they do have a writing component.
Right, so again, I would encourage you very much to look at those writing samples and hold them side by side with other samples, with all the tests. Put them side by side with each other. What are they actually asking the students to do? Are they asking them to take different sources and compare them and write an argument, do an argumentative paper, and take technical writing and use that? So, like in your science classroom, for example, you're going to read more technical type writing, lab reports, things like that. That's a different style of writing. So the way that I would respond to a technical paper is going to be very different than the way I would respond to a poem written at whatever time. So if you look at those sample items that they have up, and they have them up for everyone to see, I would look very closely at them. What kind of writing are they asking the students to do? Is it just a one-pager, or are they actually asking them to create an essay that would tell us that they're college and career ready? Because we all know when you get to college, you write papers. So that, I would encourage you to look at that.
One thing I do want to say is, I've given the benchmark or the ACTAP test for a long time, and students are used to that format. So really, in changing from that format to this computerized format, and there was a little bitty box, the time that students spent on the actual planning, preparation, writing, they didn't do well. I mean, I don't see how they could have, because it was very short. They didn't spend the time that they did on the ACTAP test. So it might have just been the fact that it was a new test and a new format, but I have a feeling that when we get those scores back, we're going to be able to see that most of them did not do a full writing piece.
And I would agree. I don't know if you want to speak to this, Denise, from looking at benchmark to now. I'll let you.
Yeah, recently for another project that we're working on for the department, I went back to 2001 and looked at how schools performed on the benchmark when we first came out of the box, because it's one of those things where we were having a debate in our office about, this is an unprecedented time, we've never been here before. And I said, now wait a minute. Now, of course, I'm probably 15 to 20 years older than everybody else in my office, because I work at a university and they're all in their 20s and early 30s. And I said, we've been here before. We've been here when we had the standards in Arkansas and we had this new test, the benchmark. And we've been down this road where it was hard. We had some schools with no students proficient back in 2001. We had some schools with 80% of their students below basic. I mean, if you remember the original definition of academic distress, and we had districts who had more than 75% of their students below basic. But that was not a reason to stop the test. That was information that we got from the test about how our students were lining up against the standards. And that was the first time we were taking a criterion reference test built to standards that we had all been given an opportunity to know we were to teach to. And what we're looking at now is not an unprecedented time so much as the state adopted Common Core in 2010, teachers have been implementing, and now we're looking at an assessment that is aligned or built for that. And will we start where we're leaving off at 76 on average of our 76% of students at the proficient or above level? No, because we're testing our students differently. The items are different for very good reasons, and part of that is because the way that we all do business is slightly different. We all use technology in ways that we could never even dream about. I'm just, honestly, I didn't use a computer until 1995, and it was an Apple IIe. And now you will never see me without at least 3 devices. And that's in a 20-year span. Can you just imagine what's changed in the way of what we can do with assessment, the way items can be designed to help us understand more about what kids know and are able to do. even though there are new parts to what we're doing, there are things that we've done before that are very familiar, and that switch over to an assessment that really looks at the standards is something we've done before. It's just really hard those first couple years because it's our first time to see what that alignment looks like when we get those results back.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. This question is directed toward Dr. Phelps. I'm looking at the handout that you gave us, and I see under U.S. Standards and Testing Policy, and you talk about euphemisms for the same old radical constructivism and authentic performance-based testing. And the folk who brought us the radical constructivist performance-based fiascos of the 1990s. Can you kind of elaborate on that, kind of talk about what you mean by that?
Well, the Common Core standards were, they were written by a very small group of people. ACT and I think College Board too lent them standards writers for free over the course of several months to do the basic work. But the lead writers, if you look at your history, were integral in the movements in the 1990s to essentially, convert our assessment systems to this sort of radical constructivist structure. Now, I use the word radical because I think we're all constructivists. I mean, we all think that to some extent students learn better when they build the knowledge for themselves. But taken to an extreme is what I think a lot of people in our ed schools are now doing. So we had these tests in Kentucky, Maryland, and California, and they were all disasters. I mean, essentially, when you go toward sort of this idealized version of validity with as authentic a test as you can have, as performance assessments with no multiple choice at all, you end up with very unreliable tests. And what happened is the scores went like this, and they all bombed, and the states got rid of them, and yet the people who were behind those fiascos, they're the people who wrote the Common Core standards. Phil Darrow, one name, Mark Tucker, Lauren Resnick, the new standards project heads. I mean, I get, the development of the Common Core standards was below the radar for a lot of us. It's when I started seeing those names that I knew there was trouble.
Okay, Hope, I have a couple of kind of specific questions, please. I appreciate all of you and all that you do, because none of us would be here if we didn't care about kids, and that's our first and foremost concern, is helping our kids and having the best thing for our kids. You said that this year the Algebra 2 and the ELA 11th was completely optional. Mm-hmm. Would schools have been required to give something else like the ACT had they opted out of those?
No, so 11th grade, the Park 11th grade literacy and Algebra 2 were completely optional. Now, the second law that is in play is the College and Career Readiness Law, but we we set out criteria based around Plan, PSAT, ACT, Compass, thank you, and Park scores that you could use any of those measures to meet the letter of the College and Career Readiness Law.
But would that be additional cost to the school districts to do that?
The Plan, PSAT are paid for by the state, so those would not be an additional cost. For the ACT, SAT, we allowed, if a student had taken an SAT or an ACT on their own, you could use that score to determine college and career readiness as well.
Okay, and is that an option in the future?
Currently, yes.
Okay, let's see. I did want to ask specifically, we're considering all the different options. Mm-hmm. What are our options that would be available and still meet all the all the requirements? And who made all these requirements anyway?
That's a very good question, and thank you. Who made the requirements are the federal government with the No Child Left Behind Act. This is the first place where we were mandated to have assessment. Now, as Denise said, Arkansas actually implemented statewide assessment prior to that. Then we have state laws that require assessment. So your state laws require the assessment at K2. They also require Plan, Explore, or PSAT, one of those two. Federal law also requires that we test all of our ELL students every year. So that's also federal. When you ask what are our options, I really see basically two options. We either purchase a shelf test, which is going to be NWA, ACT Aspire, their shelf test, and I say shelf test because the company produces the test, we purchase it, we give it, we use their rules and regulations, we use their accommodations. It's pretty well laid out for us, so that's one option. The other option is that we have a state written test, which Park, I would consider a state written test because we are part of the decision-making process. It's not a shelf test that we just purchase. We have been with Questar for years to write our benchmark assessment. A company, Questar or similar to, could help us write another Arkansas assessment that aligns to our standards. So really, those are our two options. Whenever you start looking at the process within the state government, is you have to, I can't just say I want to purchase ACT Aspire and that's what I purchase unless it's state law that I have to purchase that. There's a process where you put out a request for proposal and you let different vendors bid on your specifications for the test that you want. So it wouldn't be as easy as just saying I want that test.
Right, right. The state would have to go through a lot of stuff.
Right.
That's okay. Dr. Phelps, you said something that perked my interest. You said there were problems with the upper math and Common Core, and that's what I'm mainly interested in, so I'd like to know a few specifics about that.
Well, we'll start with the main problem is with the kids at the upper levels. Common Core moves algebra from 7th and 8th grade. Oh, sorry. In many states, algebra is now taught in 7th and 8th grade. And in the rest of the industrialized world, it's taught in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. Common Core moves Algebra 1 up to freshman year in high school. And in most of the rest of the world, kids leaving upper secondary school know calculus already before they get to college. If you don't take Algebra 1 until your freshman year in high school, are you going to have calculus before you get to college? Well, probably not. You'll probably have some kind of watered down pre-calc. But originally, apparently, there was, Common Core was to have 3 tracks. It was going to be like what other countries do. There was going to be a voc ed track, and then there was going to be this advanced track. But, you know, maybe they're still in process, but it hasn't happened yet. So the main problem is going to be with the advanced kids. You know, they're probably, Common Core may raise standards in some respects, but it obviously doesn't when it moves algebra later in the sequence.
So just the putting the kids on track to take the upper level classes.
Right, before they get to college.
True, if they don't take Algebra 1 till 9th, they're probably not going to make it to AP Cal or AB or BC, so, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, I did have one more thing I thought of. One of the panelists mentioned a few weeks ago about the transformational approach to geometry. Are you familiar with that, and do you have any?
I taught math in high school in the mid-1980s.
Oh, okay, okay.
I've forgotten that, sorry.
Okay. Wes? Would you have a comment about that? They were criticizing it
I know
pretty
the
heavily.
Common Core standards in geometry are very heavy in transformations. I have no idea why.
Do you think it's bad?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Just a couple things. Dr. Phelps, our advanced track in Arkansas, the kids do take Algebra 1 in 8th grade. Would that address your concern for the advanced students? Okay. Ms. Rainbolt, actually have a question for you regarding, I was looking at your, the cost of testing at Central. What was the cost last year?
Last year, we didn't have to buy any extra supplies. Everything was supplied by the testing company that was necessary for us to administer this test, except for basic things like pencils. But
What
this year-
supplies did you have to purchase this year?
This year, we had to purchase compasses, protractors, tracing paper, graph paper, scratch paper. We had to purchase bags to put them in so that we weren't handing every teacher that was administering a test buckets full of protractors, compasses. So there were, now, it's important for you to note that we gave paper and pencil tests. We did not do the computer tests. And I'm sure that had it been on a computer, those were not materials that we would have needed to purchase. But because we did paper pencil, everything was not supplied to us, and it was necessary for us to purchase. And the way that the paper pencil test is formatted, you have one answer folder and test book. It's all one unit. You don't have a separate answer folder. So that created additional issues. The students were not allowed to use their test books for scratch paper. They weren't allowed to write in them because it was scorable materials. So we had to go and purchase things so that they were able to do that. So it ended up costing us at the building level $11,000 additional dollars for us to give the test. Now that $11,000 figure that I gave to you also does account for us having to pay teachers whose preps we took in order to administer the test. And it's also important to note that I think the number that I wrote down was 248 preps. Teachers in our building to administer tests lost 248 prep periods when they should have been preparing for giving lessons. I mean, that's a huge cost, I think, to the students and the teachers that can't be determined in money.
Sure, I just hadn't heard that. I mean, I knew it takes a lot of time, but I had not heard it quantified that, and certainly $3,200 worth of compasses and scratch paper. You want to?
Can I speak to that?
Sure.
Just to know that was not a requirement. The test says that those could be available to students if they're being used in their regular classroom instruction already, and that was not required by the State Department that those be purchased. I do understand that some schools did have to purchase those in order for their students to have access to them, every student. The second part of that is on the consumable booklets. They actually can write in the booklet. It's just there's specifications about where they can and can't write around the answer, but they can write in their test booklet.
Okay. I saw the light come on. Mr. Davis, would you like to comment?
About the compasses, the rulers, the tools that are used on the assessments. If you looked at the assessment, it was very difficult for students to manipulate that ruler and protractor using a Chromebook without a mouse, having to get their fingers to work that thing to get to where it needs to measure or whatever. And during the development of the test, when we look at the test items, I never saw those tools being used. We don't get to use those, and I was very surprised that these were very difficult to use, and I thought if we're going to assess students and see if they know the standards, we need to give them tools that they are familiar with and not surprise them with an online tool that they never used. You have to be a math teacher to know this, but there is an online TI-84 calculator that's on the Park assessment. It's not available to the practice test. When you do anything involving trigonometry in geometry, you want to make sure that calculator is in degree mode. I'm speaking mathese here, I know. That calculator resets. Every time you close that calculator, it resets back into radian mode. And so if students don't remember to go back and reset the mode of that calculator to degree mode each time, if it's a multiple choice question, they'll probably not see their answer in one of the choices. But if it's a constructive response question, they are likely to have a wrong answer because they didn't set the calculator to the right mode. And I just think that's unfair to the students for that.
And along those lines, I know that for my children who did participate in the online version, not the paper version that we gave at our school, they had to teach the children how to take the test. Then they had to participate in practice tests just to make sure the technology was functional before they got to the actual test. So you really need to be cognizant of the additional amount of classroom time just to learn how to work the manipulatives on the computer, like how to get to the calculator, how to get to the tools, and that really was also excessive.
I lost a whole week of instructional time to get the Chromebooks in my classroom and to play with the students on how to find the website, how to go from question to question. There was very little instruction that week. We were just trying to learn how to take the test. Now, if that can be something that happens year after year after year, I can't answer that. I don't know. But there were so many changes to the PARCC test throughout the process. They made some changes. I just think the first year is always going to be the rough year. I think there are a lot of improvements to be made. I would hate to see it always be like this year after year after year. I hope that it will be better than this.
Okay. Thank you. I will say, Teacher Appreciation Week last week. Thank you for what you do. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. We've heard a lot of different stories about some of the rough spots with PARCC. We had the discussion today. The PARCC representative was here. A lot of these things certainly can be, it sounds like they could be fixed pretty easily, like dealing with the calculator and what it goes, the default and all that. The systemic question, the broader question is, this is a company that has bragged about the involvement of teachers and listening to people on the ground. How could they not know all of these problems were going to be waiting for them, particularly the two windows, the calculator? I mean, if they've got all these, I mean, that's what bothers me is well, I know who's at the helm. She was here today, but you know, how does that happen? These are all very avoidable, it seems to me, with just a little bit of work. That's a rhetorical question. I think we know the answer to that. Something that puzzles me is, so protractors and compasses are optional. Is that correct? Wouldn't you want everyone taking the test to be using the same exact tools? I mean,
Is that rhetorical, or you want me?
Well, that's rhetorical unless you disagree, which I don't see how anyone could. Go ahead.
The way the standards are written, they allow for students to use whatever tool is appropriate for them. So some students may choose to use a compass, whereas some students can explain the reasoning why I can figure out that angle measure I can tell that a 90-degree angle is by the corner of my paper because I know that.
But you just said you talked about what they need or what's appropriate for them. Earlier, someone said what's available to them. Those are completely different things. In fact, someone implied that you could have a situation where a school does not have access to this stuff. Therefore, you do not have it, even though you might need it. You don't have access because your school doesn't have it. Then the other school has it because Ms. Rainbolt went out and spent $3 grand on a bucket of protractors or whatever. I can get you a better deal, but yeah, I'm kidding. So can you clarify that for me? Because if you've got people taking the same tests and they don't have access to the same tools, that seems to me, again, how could people do that?
Right, so within the online system, all students have the exact same tools. It's all set up exactly the same. In the paper, if you were given the paper-based test.
Which they were. Which
they were, of course. There was an outline of these are the tools that are available on the online test. So these are the tools that you can make available to your students on the paper test, right? And so if students are using those in their classroom, then I would make those available to my students on the test. That's what we told our district testing coordinators.
Yeah, but
if your kids are using graph paper in the classroom, that's the kind of paper that I would supply to them as scratch paper.
Gotcha. Exactly what I thought, which is, bottom line is this. Some people are going to take the test and have the tools, and some people aren't. because they're not available in the classroom. We shouldn't be giving any test where people have different tools available. That's like saying you guys can use a calculator and you can't. Or you can use the online Chrome and it'll default to something and give you the wrong answer. That's a different deal. But this is an equity deal here. You just shouldn't have different rules for different. That just doesn't make sense. And I hope y'all protest to Park about that. That just doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's just no one. There's no justification for that.
I'm not a math teacher. I was a social studies teacher.
You're a test.
Right now, I'm a testing coordinator. But I can tell you that all of our geometry classrooms at Central High School use protractors and compasses and graph paper. I mean, that's pretty standard in a geometry classroom. So, I mean,
but you spent. What'd you spend the $3,000 on?
Well, the kids. That we have class sets, but we spent $3,000 on compasses and protractors and rulers for the students to be able to use during testing, because we had to give.
You didn't have enough for everybody to have them all at once.
At the same time, that's correct.
That's what we talked about with computers earlier.
That's correct.
You may have enough computers for everybody in a school to use a computer, but not at the same time.
That's right. We gave 557 students a geometry test.
Okay, that makes sense. That totally makes sense.
We didn't have 557 protractors and compasses and
right.
rulers.
And so if there was a school without your resources, then you would have people not without the equipment necessary to take the test. I heard the bell, but let me just mention one thing here. We are Dr. Airola. We are obviously focused on this annual summative test, but we are because that's our mission as given to us by the governor. There's certainly other stuff that we're concerned about, and there are ways to evaluate students outside that test, but that's not within our purview for the purposes of this. You know, one thing that it's not directly related to this, but I think you mentioned developmentally appropriate, and we keep coming back to this. And I have a child in pre-K in public school, Little Rock Public School, and a second grader in Little Rock Public School. The discussion on the issue of developmentally appropriate has been something like this over the last few weeks. You have one person say, this is not developmentally appropriate for a first grader, right? And then the other person talks right past them and says, why are you afraid of challenging these young kids? They can do it. And then another teacher says, I've seen my young kids do incredible things at very young age. I know they can do it. And then the other person says, no, but it's not developmentally appropriate. The folks that think it is developmentally appropriate don't address whether it is technically, most of the ones I've heard don't address whether it's technically developmentally appropriate. They address either A, the fact that the other person just doesn't want to make something hard and they want to dumb down the standards, right? Or B, they've had an experience with a bright kid who recently came up with some genius idea that proves it's developmentally appropriate. And so we have gotten really no further. I'm only going to speak for me because I have kids in this age group, right? And I'm inclined, just you and me talking, and no one else listening, I'm inclined to say, you know, look, my girl is gifted and talented. I'm not really worried about her. I'm inclined, she's going to be just fine on this stuff. But I do worry, you know, I get articles where one person's saying, an expert in early childhood, it's not developmentally appropriate. And I'd sort of put that to rest and said, yeah, well, probably it's fine. We've heard all these. So I'm doing an interview on Common Core and Hope like 2 days ago. And the person interviewing me for television was a first grade teacher who had taken off the day to do the interview for the regional television station down there. And I'm just sitting there and she says, she says, you're doing that Common Core stuff, right? And yeah. And she said, well, you know, my concern is I teach first grade, and it's just not developmentally appropriate. And I'm like, oh, God, here we go. Just when I thought I'd put it to bed. And so, you know, there truly is, it seems to me, some smoke there. And I don't know what to make of it, except that anybody that says there's 100% unanimity on this, it's just not true. There are a lot of really smart people on both sides. And some say it's going to make your child miserable and cry, and it's not appropriate. Not that it's too hard, but not appropriate. Those are different things. One says that, and the other one says, oh, you're just not pushing your kids enough. We need to push them more. And I just can't, I can't speak for the rest of the council, but I just can't get a resolution on that. Do you have...
What I can tell you, it's so funny, these conversations, you can put a lot of different words into those two sides of the coin, but it's a constant tension that exists, because developmental appropriateness varies with, I mean, what children develop at different rates, and there are times in their lives when they develop differently at the variation in that developmental difference can be huge, and then there's times in their lives when it starts to narrow, and the closer they get to becoming adults, you don't see as much variation. So when you're dealing with pre-kindergarten and kindergarten and first and second grade, developmentally appropriate is a tension that's always there, because kids are at such big ranges in terms of, we've all seen it, you know, I have a daughter who walked at 6.5 months. I have it written down, and she didn't believe me till I showed her in my awful handwriting, which I didn't learn because I missed it moving from one school to another, my cursive. I have evidence of it. Now, her daughter didn't walk until she was 15, my granddaughter, until she was 15 months. And we had a very interesting conversation about those developmental differences. And yet, by the time she's entering first grade, nobody's going to know that she didn't walk until she was 15 months. It really doesn't matter. And it didn't matter that my oldest walked when she was 6.5 months. So there's this constant tension between developmentally appropriate and where kids are developmentally and the standards themselves. And as teachers, we are having to constantly balance this, because there is, if we have no standards that we're expected to teach, then we can do what I was pretty much allowed to do in California, which is do whatever you feel like you need to do, and then it just morphs to your students. And I happen to have a very gifted group of students in California, and so I was constantly teaching at a high, challenging level. The downside of that is that you can't let where your kids are developmentally be the only compass you have for what you're expected to do or where the kids are expected to go. You've got to find that balance. So as my kids come into the classroom, I want to know where they are relative to those grade level expectations. Because for the kids who are above it, you know what? They're going to take things in a different way. They still need to be taught. They still need good learning experiences, but they're different from my kids that I'm going to need to catch up, or my kids who really need some intense intervention. And so finding that balance as a teacher is difficult. When it comes to a summative assessment, the purpose of the summative assessment is to give you information more at aggregate levels about, you know, in general, do we see our schools, if you think about the accountability context our summative assessments are being used in, do we see schools where that alignment exists to the extent that it should exist, and where we don't, why don't we see it? So it should be a pointer for us to investigate more deeply at the school level. You know, why are we not seeing as many students getting to this particular level in that's expected of them? And that gets you into those deeper conversations, and then you have to think about the developmental piece.
Yeah,
and how do we support that?
It's less about the assessments, obviously, because the assessments are just reflective of the standards. It's more about the standards. And we would all agree that 12th grade teaching is not developmentally appropriate for a first grader.
Right.
So as you go down, the question is, where is that line? And a lot of people, reputable people, say the line, they got it wrong. And then a lot of other reputable people say, no, they got it just right.
Right.
And this looks like an area where there's just complete and utter disarray among experts. So,
Well, and there's some research that informs that, and part of that, you think about grades 3 through 8, that we start our summative assessment in the state at grade 3, and there was a lot of research done in early reading that said, if you don't have kids on grade level by grade 3, then their chances of being on grade level, are very, very poor as you go up in the years. So there's some research that informs some of that, but you can speak to, you've had people from all kinds of universities and academics come in, and everybody has lots of different opinions
yeah, they all
about
disagree, so.
That's why we have to go back to the principles of things.
Along the developmental lines, though, I'd like to point out to you that these standards and this battery of assessments do not address special needs kids or English learners appropriately. We no longer allowed to use portfolios to assess our most profoundly special needs students. They have to participate in a computer-based test where they don't have the fine motor skills to do, and they're not allowed to use the benefit of hand over hand. So at our school, we have students that have very little motor skills, nonverbal students who we are tasked with giving an online assessment, and we're accountable for those scores.
Thank you.
And even beyond our accountability, it's kind of cruel to do that to a kid. And then there's the English learners who have to take, and then the other special needs students who get the benefit of extended time, but we know their special needs are not such that they would take the NICSIC, but we know that they can't read, and we know that they're classified as MR, but they're going to take the same test as our AP students are taking, and there's no consideration for that. And I think that's a huge flaw in this.
That's required by what? State law, federal law?
Well, I know that under the ACTAP, Ms. Allen can probably address that question, but under the ACTAP...
You can start my time because this is my question.
Okay.
Oh, good.
So I know that under the ACTAP, we were allowed to provide portfolios for our special needs students.
My question is, we have a 1% cap from the state.
Yep.
Federal law is 2%. Why do we have 1%? Why does the state of Arkansas? Okay, and here's my deal. Can I finish?
Yes.
We have 1% cap on the kids, okay? In the district, we're allowed 9 exempt. I have 16 severe and profound kids. That means I have to test 7 on the PARCC test at their grade level. Not where they're at, but at their grade level. Not where they've been taught so you can teach them something, but at their grade level. So and then on top of that, I have 43 portfolio kids, and they all have to take. And on top of that, I've got 60 IEP kids, okay? You're tagging all of our kids. How are we going to be, our school is good. We've got all of it, but we've got such a huge tag group, you're killing us.
So I want to, well...
Do you see my point?
Yes, and I just want to...
No?
Yes. I want to say that I have just this week, I heard from some people who are actively part of administering the PARCC assessment, and they were saying to me, you're going to talk to that panel, you need to tell them, some kids with severe emotional issues who have viewed this assessment not as a punishment, which is how they usually view it when it's paper and pencil, but as an opportunity. And so for every story, we are I'm just going to say we're vulnerable to anecdotes in our world, which is why I love data and I love surveys. But I've heard from several that the assessment accommodations and not just the accommodations, but the accessibility features allow a lot of different things to happen that couldn't happen on paper and pencil. And so there's pros and cons there. We had these same arguments with the benchmark. Act 999 of 1999 was the state accountability piece that brought all this accountability around the benchmark into play before No Child Left Behind came into being. And when that was first done, we had these issues about those significantly cognitively disabled students. And then the federal government came along with No Child Left Behind and said, we're going to make sure that you don't, they put a cap of 1%. It's a federal requirement, that 1%, for significantly cognitively disabled. Now, there's a couple years after the 1%, states were fussing about it. So they came back. They never changed the 1% for significantly cognitively disabled students that have to be guided by their IEP. What they came back and then they did was say, you can have an additional 1%, but not for those students. This is for a different set of students. And to do that, you have to assess them properly. And there was a decision made years ago that precedes pretty much everybody that I know is in the department now, that the state couldn't afford to develop that that other assessment on that second 1%. So it's not the same thing. So the federal flexibility is different. So the 1% is one thing, the other 1% is a different type of test, and the state would have had to develop a different type of test at that point in time.
So that's why Arkansas doesn't have it.
I can speak to the accommodations like Denise was saying. For our ELL students, there are several accommodations that we were not offering under benchmark that we now can offer through the park assessment, and several of our other assessments that you've heard from this morning. Also, the fact that, for example, the math can be read to any student because it's not a reading test.
But the
that's
literacy
available to all
can't.
students.
But the literacy
Exactly, and the reason is because the literacy assessment is a reading and writing assessment combined. So we are actually measuring reading. So students can have the literacy test read to them. There's nothing that says they can't. They just have to have that decision made by their local IEP team to say, yes, this student needs the the ELA assessment read to them. So that is an option for schools and for students, and that's a local decision to
for very
allow
few
that.
of the children.
I want to go back to the English learners. Some of the new accommodations are that the instructions can be clarified in a student's native language by a certified teacher. The park allows for 12 languages to be clarified in their native language by a certified teacher. At Central High School, we have 23 languages spoken. In the Little Rock School District, at any given time, it fluctuates between 48 and 53 languages spoken. We don't have a certified teacher that speaks Gujarati. We also don't have one that speaks Igbo, nor does Park provide those instructions in either of those languages. So you again come into an equity issue. We have a Chinese-speaking teacher, we have a German teacher, we have a French teacher in the building. We can clarify those for those students because it's available. But the accommodations that are allowed and that we are allowed to give are impossible to give. So if we're reading instructions to the Spanish students, the student sitting next to him who speaks Gujarati has just got to work it out. I mean, there are really a lot of equity issues here that really have been overlooked.
So to speak to that, what Park did was provided the top 10 languages across the consortium. The general administration directions were translated to the top 10 languages across the consortium, and those were provided in print form. Schools can if they choose, take the general directions and translate them into any language for their students if they so choose to do so, and hand those to the students in a printed form. So when we're talking about the test in the student's native language, it's not the entire test, it's just the general administration directions, which do allow access to some students better than having those directions in English. So just wanted to clarify the piece of that.
I have one more question, quick. I know, I don't have much time. Say you have a student that comes into your district the day you're testing algebra, and you ask that student, which was last Monday, have you taken the Park test? No, I haven't. So we get ready and we gonna put her in the Park test, but we just happened to call the school she came from. She did take the Park test. My deal is we need to get a little bit more communication for that to follow, for one, and two, when that child is taking that Park test at another school and she moves into our district in the last month, guess who gets tagged with her score?
Right, and I'm going to ask Denise to speak to the highly mobile piece of that in just a second. On the, Denise helps with some of our calculations for accountability, so I'm going to have her talk to that. But for the fact of the movement, we do communicate directly to district testing coordinators and have communicated to them on a weekly basis. And in fact, right before the EOY window opened and right before the PBA window opened, we communicated to all district testing coordinators, if a student moves into your district during this window, please contact us first, and we will get them moved over. There's even an online form you can put in real quick. My team works on that all day long in the office to get students moved over within a 24-hour period so that schools, if a kid moves in on Monday and you're testing on Tuesday, that kid's there and ready to go. So I agree with you. There is some communication that has to happen there. We have communicated that out. I think my office, that's one of our goals, is to communicate better next year and to streamline those communication processes so that schools, you know, the first year of any new program is a learning year for everybody. And there are a ton of things that my office, we've already been working on. What can we do better? How can we streamline this process? How can we help schools? Because we know that it is a learning, painful year. And we want to make it as streamless as possible. We want districts to be able to test and it be part of their classroom instruction, not something huge burden that we have to do that takes hours and hours and months and months. That's not what we want it to be. It needs to be integrated into the day.
I'll speak to the mobility issue because in terms of accountability, the students who move within the testing time period, they generally are designated as a student who is mobile. They're not a full academic year. So for accountability purposes, the scores of that student are generally not counted for that particular school.
Is there a way to tag that?
Yes,
or
yes.
So we need to call the
Yes.
Department of Ed to find out?
No.
Okay.
So there's a couple different ways, and this is again getting to, it's been an interesting journey, but getting to dealing with the new data from a new group. I will tell you what's interesting is that handling data from 5 different assessment vendors, everybody's got commonalities in terms of the issues, and then there's also things that are distinct to each of the different groups. But for the mobility, that information is brought together at the time of that accountability is calculated. And what they look at is when was the student enrolled in your school, and students who have multiple enrollments between October 1 and the time of testing, the time that it's pulled for that participation, that student is indicated as a mobile student for the record, and then that information is matched up to the student's test information. And that's how we get that. And then that is not always a perfect process because we've learned a lot this year about how much hands-on the people who deal with the repercussions of the data system actually enter the data. There's a little disconnect there sometimes. So there's appeal periods where data can, where schools have an opportunity to go in and take a look at that information and make sure that that information is accurate in describing the student. So there is a process to handle that. And the idea of a full academic year is really, really an integral part of that accountability, that a student should be with you a full academic year before they count in your scores for your school.
Just want to remind people, if you need to take a break, just take it.
Ms. Rainbolt, this question is for you in terms of your experiences with the recent assessment. Are there others in Little Rock that had similar experiences around the state that you're aware of, or do you just know about what you dealt with?
I can really only speak to what I dealt with. I would say to you that the issues would be the same building to building for paper-based assessments. I don't know if any other school in our district went and purchased protractors or tracing paper for their students. It's a building level decision. We have the benefit of when we ask our building administrator for supplies that our students need, she lets us do it. I don't know that other administrators do that. I don't know. Okay. But I can tell you that issues like accommodations and special needs students, those are in every building, and I don't think that they are exclusive to the paper-based tests either. I think that that's for computer-based tests, paper-based tests, and it's everywhere.
Okay, all right. And and part of my question is being in Springdale, similar population in terms of numbers, poverty. I don't know how many languages are spoken, but I know there's lots of those that are there. And I had a chance to visit with just a district level testing coordinator to get a feel for things in Springdale, and it wasn't quite the way you painted it, but I don't know that there were paper assessments in our district, so there was not. Okay.
Well,
All right.
I can also tell you that sometimes a district level testing coordinator is not really familiar about issues within the building. I mean, we do report back to her big issues, but you know, she's worried about the entire district. So they're usually not really intimately familiar with what really is happening at the building level with the actual testing processes and procedures, because their job is much broader and very different than administering the tests themselves.
Gotcha. Good point. Wes, question for you. You kind of described some challenges with the assessment at your school or your class. Some of those things, and the Lieutenant Governor talked about it, if they were fixed, how would you feel about the assessment? So let's fix those things like the calculator issue or some other things. Take that out of those things that appear to be simple fixes. What do you think?
I think the computer-based testing is the way to go. It's cheaper. Cheaper is good, I think, when you're in the state budget. If all those fixes were made, I think that's the way to do it. My only issue with Park, and I sat on that for 3 weeks and did this, is that they would have questions that would ask you to pretty much do 6 different computations. It was called multiple select. And so the student have to choose basically 6 true-false questions, basically. You have to do 6 problems in one question, 6 problems. If you made any mistake in those 6 parts, the score would be a 0. Okay. There was no partial credit given for those questions. Those are the only things I feel that are unfair on the Park exam, is that you're going to ask students to do 6 things, and they make 1 mistake out of the 6, and they're getting a 0. They did 5 things correctly, but they missed 1 and they get a 0. That's the only thing I had. That does not really deal with the calculators or the manipulatives, but if those are fixed, I think the computer-based version of the Park is it's rigorous. I think teachers will adjust to that. They did with the benchmark exams. If that were to be fixed, I feel like it's a good tool to use.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll take that answer and address the next question to you. Are those things that can easily be fixed? Can we have some influence with Park, or if there's another assessment tool that this council recommends, can those sorts of things be changed?
I would say definitely. There are things that at the consortium level we started talking about 2 months ago. The things of the 2 windows, we knew the 2 windows were going to be problematic. In theory, it's a great idea. People, have said for years, please don't take a one-day snapshot of my kids. Look at my kids over time. And we tried that, and administratively, that becomes very difficult. So there are things, I think, to address your point with the questions, I know the people on my team, they feed back to me the same concerns they hear from Wes and other teachers in the state, and then I take those to the table with Park. And what ends up happening is we find that educators from across the states have the same concerns. And so there's many times with exactly this concern where, yes, we can make an adjustment to the design, we can make an adjustment to the types of questions. We did that with ELA. There were ELA questions that were asking the kids to do 4 and 5 things, and it was a 1-point question. And we said, that's absolutely ridiculous. Backed it down to they had to do 2 things for a 1-point question. So yes.
Okay. Just real quick, one other thing. Okay, I understand, I guess there's 11 states in the District of Columbia that are still part of Park. I know there's also Smarter Balance that's out there. Is there another group that is larger than 12 states? Or, is Park the biggest?
At the moment, yeah.
Okay,
at the moment.
all right, that's it.
Okay, my questions are going to be pretty short, and pretty short and sweet. Kind of getting back to what we were talking about, whenever we first started giving the benchmark testing, we had, what, 60% not scored proficient, but then over the years we had, we had more than, we had 60% not scored proficient, then we had over 60% scored proficient. Is that getting back to where we're kind of teaching to the test? Because, I mean, whenever we first roll out these standards, I mean, and we expect the same thing to probably I mean, not saying that it will happen, we hope it doesn't, but if it does happen, and then every year we just get better at getting to park, I mean, what's your thoughts on that? Because, like, you never really see, I mean, I guess from whenever ACT first started, scores have risen, but you don't see the ACT scores just getting, I mean, like he said earlier, technically every student could score 36, but students never do score, like, not all students ever score that. So do you understand where I'm kind of going?
Yes, and there's two different parts to that. One is the difference between, like, an ACT, which is a norm reference score. When they update the norming group. So that group of students that you're being compared to, that you get your score from, gets updated every 5 to 8 years, depending on their cycle and other things that are going on. Whereas more substantive changes to the test in terms of its content might happen less frequently. With a criterion reference test, you would expect that you would get better at it if you know what standards you're expected to teach, and you know that those standards are being assessed, and you're teaching your students so that they learn those standards and can demonstrate and apply those standards in new and unique environments, then you expect that students are going to do better. The criterion reference score gives you different information than what a norm reference score gives you.
So, kind of, I mean, I just got through with them. So basically, the criterion reference, now correct me if I'm wrong, is kind of like a final exam over statewide, because, I mean, like, with the final exam, you have material that is taught throughout the semester, and at the end of the semester, you teach over those concepts that you just had. So that's what the criterion reference is. And then, like, a norm reference test is, like you said, would be given, like, kind of over, like, kind of backdooring ideas that were not, it's testing over the ideas that you were taught, but kind of in an indirect way.
Well, it varies. So that's with a norm, when you can have tests now. I mean, we used to talk in terms of this is a norm reference test, this is a criterion reference test, and over the past 15 years, really, you've seen this move where the same test can give you both criterion reference scores and norm reference scores. That norm reference score varies depending on who's taking that test, and you heard several of the vendors today talk about that they could give you those types of scores. But the value of the criterion reference score is very closely tied to how well those standards that are being assessed are aligned with the standards that you're expected to teach. And even when that's the case, like with the Arkansas benchmark, we've been giving the benchmark for a long time. The last time the standards, we would have been in a standards adjustment for literacy and math a couple of years ago, except the Common Core became that adjustment. And so we would have been adjusting the benchmark. We should have been adjusting the benchmark. We need to reset the standard levels because we've gotten to a point where we've gotten as much as we could get out of the test based on what we knew when we first started the test. And there's a point in time where you have to assess whether or not the information you're getting is telling you enough about how your kids are doing relative to either changes in your standards or relative to changes in the goals you have for the students. And in our case, Arkansas has this college and career ready piece that is different from how the benchmark was originally intended to assess. And so you really have to look at, even if we weren't, when it was first suggested, when I first heard that the idea was to go back to the old benchmark, I wanted to fall out because it concerned me that that test would have needed an update to not so much the items themselves, but how we set the standards for the performance levels, because we needed to increase rigor in many areas. We were topping out on that test based on standards we'd set 10 years ago.
So, like, kind of like what you're saying now is the benchmark standards need to be updated. Well, they were basically overhauled with now Common Core.
That's right.
I think kind of standards? I mean, standards are going to have to be mobile, I feel like, in society.
Well,
I made that comment the other day.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of a massive overhaul. And then just one last question. It's really easy, short. Now, did you say we have to, by federal law, we're required to have a criterion-based test? Is that, I mean...
Right, so by federal law...
That was at your very beginning.
Right.
That was at
By
your very
federal law,
beginning.
we're required to have a test that is aligned with the state's
standards.
academic
Okay.
content standards.
Now...
That's what the law says. And state law backs that up.
Okay. Now, would the Aspire... I know the Aspire test isn't directly related with those standards. I mean, he said that they kind of base it off that, but it's not directly like Park is. Would that fit that law or not?
The Aspire system has passed what we call peer review, which peer review is where the federal government looks at the assessment and determines does it meet the letter of the law. And that did pass peer review in Alabama. So to directly answer your question, yes.
Okay, I just didn't want to like, if we were to adopt the ACT or the Aspire thing, that we wouldn't have to have another test on top of that to meet the other requirements. Does that make sense? Like,
Yes.
I was just trying to, like, if we got that one, then, oh, well, now here you're going to have all these, you're going to have more to meet other requirements. So that was it. Thank you.
I'd like to reiterate something that Dr. Phelps mentioned earlier, I believe. You asked this question. It's going to be impossible, I think, for teachers to teach to the Park test. It's like teaching to the AP stat exam. You just can't do it. You have to teach to the standards. Now, the old benchmark standard, the old state standard we had in geometry, I think it was easier to teach to that test because the questions, to me, and I've taught all this, were not as complex as the Park exam questions. Park is rigorous. There's not as many questions on the Park exam. They require a lot more thinking. And teachers will not be able to teach. There are not many released items. You will not be able to teach to that test. You have to teach to Common Core. When we developed the Park test, one thing that kind of bothered me was that we really didn't go back to Common Core standards to see if the question actually fit. Park had taken the Common Core standards themselves and developed what's called evidence statements. And we just went back and looked at evidence statements to see if the question actually met evidence statements. We had no idea. I think we did, but maybe we didn't, if the evidence statement really was a part of the Common Core standards. We just trusted Park in that.
I can say one item review that I was in. We did actually pull up the standards and the evidence tables and the question. And so, and that's been a practice since I've been on board, I know. So that does happen as well.
If teachers know what exactly is going to be on a test form, the problem is not teaching to the test. The problem is something happened with test security. Also, to add to what Denise was saying, if criterion reference tests are equated as well as having their norms updated, so that's why you have 5 different ACT or SAT test forms given in the same year, and they end up with equivalent scores. They may have different levels of the populations taking them may be different, but they're common items. And okay, so you know what I'm talking about.
I would like to take the opportunity to recognize Ms. Nancy Russo. Mr. Lieutenant Governor, she was my daughter's principal. So great seeing you again, Ms. Russo. Is there an opt-out option for Park testing for Arkansas?
So state law says that all students shall participate in the statewide assessment program. And so because Park is our statewide assessment program, there is no recognized opt-out.
Okay. Have there been a cost-effectiveness analysis done for Park versus these other potential off-the-shelf testing processes?
I'm very glad you asked that. I was waiting for that question, actually. Going with the Park assessment compared to our benchmark assessment, the state of Arkansas is going to save over $4 million. So right off the top, moving to online testing, part of that is because we're in a consortium, so we're still getting a very high-level test. We have written responses that are hand-scored by humans. We have math open response items that are hand-scored by humans. That is a value that we get of being part of the consortium, so that's where our cost savings comes in. When you look at the other tests, we have price compared. You really are right around the same price point. You're somewhere between $20 to $25 per student. But you really have to look at, and some come in under that. So, I think one quoted us earlier, $18 per student. But what you want to look at is when you look at that price, what are you getting? What are you giving up by saving $2 per student, and what are you gaining by paying $2 more per student? So
So what is the net cost? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to.
What's the end cost?
The net cost, you know.
To give the park assessment this year, is that what you're asking me?
Yes.
With my Pearson contract and my Park Inc. contract, so both of those together, because there's two separate contracts, the total cost is, it's $9 million for the Pearson and $284,000 for the park.
And so what was the price, what was the cost for Benchmark?
For Benchmark, that number was $4 million higher. And I misquoted there. Our original contract was for $9 million. We reconciled in January. When we wrote our original contract, we wrote it for 50% paper, 50% online. So that was what our price was quoted. Arkansas ended up being closer to 90% online, 10% paper, so we reconciled. So that price then came down to $7.9 million for my Pearson contract.
Okay. For the first 3 years of Common Core, Luke tells me there was no testing, but there was still benchmark testing, correctly?
Yeah.
Have there been an analysis of, for those grades, with Common Core and not Common Core? Understand my question?
Right, and so this is the first year that we've had a Common Core aligned assessment. I was in a district last year as a secondary math specialist, and I can tell you, because we were testing on the benchmark, my teachers taught the benchmark, the Arkansas standards, even though we were supposed to be teaching the Common Core standards. So at the high school level, that's what we did, because that was what we were held accountable to. This will be the first year that our standards are again aligned to our assessment, and so this will be when we can. Let me restate my
question, because that's not my question. 3 years ago, we started Common Core for K through the third grade. Okay, so prior to 3 years ago, okay, we had what the testing results for those in that same grade. So I'm asking, we did the same testing that year. Did we see a difference in the results of the testing? That's what I'm trying to get a sense of.
Denise, do you want to speak?
I keep forgetting this thing. I'm not sure. I think
so. Let me restate it then.
Yeah.
3 years ago, we implemented K through 3 through third grade. Okay, so 2 years ago, we tested for that same grade.
Right.
Did we see a difference in the results?
Well, we've seen differences in the results for the past...
From benchmark, just for benchmark?
Just from benchmark.
Yeah.
I don't know if I disentangled benchmark alone, but part of the issue that we have, we've seen our state basically topped out on average in 2011 and 2012. And then we've seen decreases in 2013 and 2014. Now, it could be that that's because the test was aligned to the old standards and teachers were being asked to teach the new standards. We can't know that for sure, because what we do know is that anecdotally, some schools were implementing Common Core and some schools were implementing the old standards because they were held accountable to the old standards. Okay. So we can't disentangle any effect of that for certain.
Okay.
But we do know that, I call it the perfect storm of things, that we've had all of this occur at a time when our test was really getting to its sunset years,
sure.
where we're getting the most out of it. Okay.
New York been in Common Core for a while, and this article that the Lieutenant Governor shared with us, what they saw was, well, let me start over. What are we going to do with these results? You know, once we get these results in November, and we find teachers that we find these students that will be at 1 versus we want them at 3, what are we going to do? Have we gone down that road yet?
We've been there. We did this. We've been through this as a state when we started the benchmark. It was a significant shift in the complexity of assessment when we went to a test that had constructed response items. nobody had been taking items like we had in that literacy side of our benchmark exam. The idea that students were going to construct a response to a reading passage question was not something we were used to seeing assessed. So we have been there. And the whole idea behind the assessment is to give you, if we're talking about the true purpose of this state summative assessment, you're going to get scores back that are going to give you information at the state level, information at the district level, information at the school level, information within the school to help you understand at the grade level where are your alignment issues potentially, what are your strengths and concerns. At the student level, it's going to give you information about the student themselves as well. We just have to be very careful that we don't try to use that information in ways it wasn't intended to be used, because it is a state summative assessment. And so it gives us a general idea of where we need to take our next steps. And yes, we've been there where we've said, oh my gosh, where do we start? But that's a place we've been before.
So if I understand your answer, it's going to be bad. And this is what happened in New York. He says, I can tell you that students of color, economically disadvantaged students, and special education students disproportionately failed our Common Core test, both in 2013 and 2014. New York's achievement gap increased. So, have we thought about this? Is this something that we think going to happen for Arkansas?
We have an achievement gap now on the benchmark, right? So we know it, it's there, and we've been, well, that's part of what we've all been trying to do, is reduce that achievement gap, and it exists. It's alive and well, and some of the concerns we have about TAG are that, you know, at least with the TAG, 96% of schools have a TAG. They're actually accountable for students who are at risk educationally because of poverty, because of special needs, or because of English language learning. So we've got that situation now. We're going to get a baseline from 2015 PARCC scores relative to a new set of standards. So I don't think about the scores in 2014 and the scores in 2015 as being comparable, because they're testing on two different sets of standards. We're setting a new baseline in 2015, and it's a baseline on students' college and career readiness. And what we know from our other data is that those achievement gaps exist, and they're big, and we need to do something about them. And we know that because we can look at ACT data, we can look at Explore data, we can look at Plan data, we can look at the norm referenced assessment data. We have that information. It's just now it's going to be specific to the standards that we're expected to teach when we have a test that tests that.
And what I'm hopeful for from this commission is our substantive proposals that's going to get us past what we know we're going to be anyway. And if we had achievement gaps with the benchmark, of course we're going to have gaps, and we got to do something differently. And last thing, and I'll stop. I'm glad you didn't push the button, by the way.
We've got plenty of time. Finish it on out with you.
I will tell you, an unintended consequence of knowing as much as we did about our assessment, our benchmark assessment, was that we've seen an abuse of this. I don't want to call it an abuse, but there are places that have gotten to the point where they're teaching to the open response items and they're ignoring the standards. When you teach to the test and ignore the broader standards that you need to be teaching to, you get to a point where you don't see continued improvements. You get these short-term bumps and gains, but you don't see what you need to see in an aligned system of instruction, of standards instruction and assessment. And so you've seen systems that have done really well over the course, and you can see them. We've got lots of fun charts and graphs that we can put together that show that. But you also see systems that have not seen that type of improvement, that have not reduced the gaps by any amount. And when you go into those systems, what you find out is that they don't have a system of instruction. They're not looking at the standards, they're doing test preparation in place of real instruction. And we've seen that unintended consequence of the misuse of state summative data. And I think that's as big of a danger under any test that so I don't care who your vendor is, if we don't help people do a really good job of understanding how to use the information, we're going to be in the same boat no matter what product is picked.
Right. My last comment is this.
I want to point out along the line of misuse of data, we've just established that for the last 2 years, we've been tasked with teaching Common Core, but we've tested the Arkansas state standards. And schools have still been allowed to go further into school improvement based on those results, which we know are not aligned between the standards and the test. So I think that's a really important point and kind of a misuse of data.
Well, they're carrying out state law, though.
I just want to say, the more complex the assessment type, I think the more you'll see the achievement gap increase. The more straightforward, the more it's aligned to what the kids have taken directly in class. The less complex, I think the more the achievement gap narrows.
And so the definition of insanity is. But my last comment.
I just think the kids who are behind have, the more clarity there is, the better they do, at least relatively.
Right.
The more complicated you make the assessment, the more confusing it is.
Right. I'm not concerned about spending $3,000 on park resources because, Ms. Russo, graduates of Central High walk away with millions of dollars in scholarships. Peanuts from if we want to make sure our students have the resources they need to do the best on these tests. So I'm not concerned about $3,000.
I got the same question for everybody, but a couple things first. Just as we've administered Park in our schools, I've been really impressed with overall how it's gone. And having been a teacher and done the previous tests, knowing that Arkansas was going to do a computer-based online state assessment, my guard was up. I think that I don't like how long it takes for us to get the results back. I don't like how long the test takes. But I think 90% of the problems we've had with the Park has been our own fault in terms of how we're training our teachers, equipping our teachers. Our kids don't know how to use the computers. It's because we didn't teach them how to use the computers, not something that can be fixed by a testing company somewhere. We should teach them how to use the computers, and I think that's a fair expectation. So I just know we've been in contact with you a lot, Ms. Allen, as we've tried to fix some of our problems, and I'm just overall impressed with the responsiveness around the complexity of doing this the first go around. I think we actually have a lot of agreement around all the things that are really hard about testing and all the challenges there are to overcome. And at the end of the day, we have to follow No Child Left Behind. We have to follow state law. So my question is a multiple choice one. In spring of 2017, the state of Arkansas should use blank for grades 3 through 10, or 8, or 10, let's call it 3 through 10. Choice A is Park, B is ACT Aspire, C is NWA MAP, or D, Arkansas should create its own new thing. Let's just take it as a given that we're going to have to do some summative assessment in grades 3 through 10. What should it be? A, B, C, D.
I think from my perspective, we gave the Park assessment this year. If we're going to give it next year, my answer would be stay with that assessment. It is a high quality assessment. If we can work out the bugs, we can work out where we feel like there's an inequality for schools. I think that the burden on our schools from switching from benchmark to Park and then maybe something else in 2 years, that is more of a detriment to our schools than if we worked out the problems with our system that we have because I feel that it's high quality.
Thank you.
I really cannot speak to the other tests you mentioned. I know nothing about those. I would love to see the state of Arkansas develop its own thing, personally. I think we have the resources and people to do that. That would take a lot of time and money, though. Park is ready. I do think that we've already started the process, and if we keep changing, we're not going to gain any progress. That's how I feel about it.
So your answer's A?
Maybe.
Is there an E? I mean,
I'm just teasing.
ACT, and this is funny, everybody here is going to say something different, but I say ACT. ACT is proven reliable, it's proven valid, it's the endpoint that everybody is going to eventually get to determine college and career readiness. It's what every college in the nation now uses. Now, the SAT is also used, but every college will accept an ACT score. Every student who goes to college, almost every student will take the ACT. So it just makes sense to go with what they're ultimately going to do anyway in order to get into college.
Thank you.
I don't live here. I don't think you should take my advice.
But you're on the panel. You're on the panel. You're taking the test, so you have to give an answer.
Well, I think it depends on what you want, and I'm not sure what all your priorities and goals are.
What does that mean?
If it were up to me,
What does that mean?
If I were the dictator of Arkansas, I would aim, at least in the long run, toward developing your own tests. I think Sandy Stotsky is right. If you don't control the test, you really don't control your education system. And granted, they're going to give you the data, but they have copyright on all the items. But can you do it next year? No. Can you do it 2 years from now? No. So we're in a no man's land.
That's a hard question to answer without saying a lot of things. I'm familiar with a lot of the other assessments in a broad and general way. I'm familiar with what their original assessment was designed to be, and they've all pretty much spoken to that to you today. If I go back to the principles of assessment, and I go back to purpose, and I think about the purpose of the state summative assessment scores are going to be used, whether we like it or not, by state law and/or federal law in high-stakes applications. They're going to be used for school accountability. Down the road, they could be used for teacher effectiveness. They're used right now for students to determine whether or not a student needs an academic improvement plan, intensive reading intervention, et cetera. So given a high stakes use, given the idea that it's a state summative assessment, given that as the purpose, then I would want an assessment that is built for the standards that I'm expected to teach. Now, that eliminates 2 and leaves me with 2. And that's when you have to bring in reality. Because, there was a point in time where I thought about, boy, if I could, rule assessment and decide exactly what we were going to do, I would think about this. And I've had the opportunity over the past 11 years to build my skill set and my knowledge about assessment and measurement. It's an area that I'm just fascinated by. And I have had the opportunity and privilege to interact with a lot of the park individuals, and it's something that I don't know that we could replicate as a state because I don't know that we could afford it. Right now, Arkansas is benefiting from every state agency's brain trust of knowledge about what has and hasn't been done appropriately in former testing programs. Right now, there's a group of 11, approximately, that meet with the psychometricians. They meet with the Pearson group that's handling the testing platform, And these guys get grilled in ways that, as a state, we just don't have, you can't pay for that opportunity because we can't afford that opportunity ourselves unless we really increase the cost of assessment. I think you have to go computer-based because that's where our kids are going, and it's just us as adults that sometimes hold back on that sort of thing. But if you look at where innovative instruction is going, having the opportunity to learn in multiple modes and having an opportunity for computer-based instruction and a combination of blended learning is something we're seeing more and more of. We need to be able to handle that so, if I narrow it down to purpose being it needs to be aligned to our standards because we're going to use it for high stakes usages. Given that, we want the best possible assessment. Then your question becomes, what can we afford to do and when can we afford to do that? You right now have an opportunity in front of you that we're currently participating in that has brought to the state of Arkansas more of the experts than you could ever imagine, and lots of the debate. You would not believe the debates that they have about the very issues that you guys are discussing. And it's a phenomenal thing to get to be a part of and to witness, and to know that that information is building into the quality of that assessment. And you're not having to cut corners to do that. You're not having to give up this to get that. I just don't know that we've ever been in a situation where our tax dollars, our federal tax dollars, are at work for us, and we're actually double dipping into it to get such a great payback back on something.
Thank you.
Jason. Jason Williamson.
I'll pass, just playing.
No, can't take it back. Your word, your bond.
I know, right? And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest among these is love. Unless, of course, it's testing season in Arkansas, and then it's hope. We really appreciate your work, Ms. Allen, in Nashville, Arkansas. You were a godsend to us. You did great. But what I want to know for you, first of all, is why did we not adopt? Why did we not look at adopting something K-12? Because I think that added to our testing. When I say added, we could have adopted something K-12 and not necessarily had the need for Iowa at the lower grades. Can you help me with that some?
Yes. So because assessment for K-2 is quite different and should look very different than for 3-12. Much of what Denise spoke to earlier, there's that piece of it. The second piece is we joined into the PARC consortium so that we could benefit from these federal dollars that we were able to use to create a test. So Arkansas didn't have to pay for it, for this development process, which is your very expensive process of any test. And so we jumped into that with that design being a 3 through grade 11 product, with also the design on that there's going to be K-2 tools as well. So I would agree with you. Yes, I think for our schools, it would be fantastic to have one system. Everybody's on one system, uses the same system. It's all aligned. The problem comes in that what we need for K-2 looks very different to what we need for 3-12.
Dr. Airola, your explanation about development appropriateness has been the best I've heard. It helped clear a lot of things up for me. I don't know about the lieutenant governor, but I got a clear picture now. I was
trying to be developmentally appropriate.
This question is for you again, Ms. Hope. It seems to me earlier, PARC's goal is to be like ACT. They created the Pioneer program. They want to go to the colleges, SAU being one of them that's already signed on, to try to get their assessment to be like what ACT already does. I just don't understand how we can say PARC is the best for us when we already have a nationally competitive, accepted test that's out there that tests the same skill set that we're looking for college and career readiness, unless you're telling me Park also, independently of ACT, gets you ready for workforce development and things of that nature, if it offers that piece. But it's hard for me to look at Park as on the same level with ACT, because I took the ACT, and most people do that to go to college. Can you help me with that?
Yeah, so I think that the ACT is what it is because it's been around for a long time. It's been proven, right? So we're in our first year of the Park assessment. I do think that the reason Park is working with higher ed, and my department wants to work with higher ed, is because if we're going to give a test to students and have a test at the high school level, there needs to be some value to that they can use beyond high school. And so if it is the case that higher ed is willing to use these scores because they find value in them like they do with the ACT, then that's just an added bonus for our kids. As the State Department, our job is to test the standards that are being taught in the school. So that is my focus. Are we testing the standards that are being taught? And when you look at the ACT, I have taken kids personally that had made a 20 on the ACT. I prepped them for 6 weeks, and they made a 24 on the ACT. I could not do that with the Park assessment. And the reason is because the skill level that is there, I can teach to that test. I can teach that multiple choice test and show you tricks with mathematics that will take anybody up a point or two for sure. With the Park assessment, what we're asking kids to do is show their understanding and reasoning, and you don't get that on the ACT. There's never a point with mathematics that you have to show your work, you have to explain your knowledge. There's never a point with there's not even a required writing piece of it. So I think when you look at the two, you have to really look at what are you getting. ACT is what it is. It has a very reputable name for good reason, and ACT is used by higher ed, and for good reason. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but I think for the purpose of assessing what is taught in our schools through grade 10, is my personal belief, through grade 10, we need an assessment that is aligned to the standards. Grades 11 and 12, I could very easily see us kind of going off into this career pathway and helping kids develop out the skills they need to be successful in those particular careers.
Will we get the same discount because this is Pearson delivered anyway? Would we get the same discount with ACT?
No, they're actually totally separate price points. So you get, the Park contract was negotiated through New Mexico, and so through that process, Pearson came to us and said, this is the price point that we will give you the test. ACT would do the exact same thing if we were to put out a bid for an assessment. And like I said earlier, it's not like I can say, we want to purchase ACT Aspire, and that's what we're going to purchase. The state would write up a request for a proposal that says, these are the elements we want. ACT would come back with a price point. Park may come back with a price point because they both can show that they match the criteria we want. And then at that point, the state goes through their process of choosing.
I just want to add, too, that ACT does, I mean, they've been around a long time, and I don't have any issues. I was trying to use Explore, Plan, and ACT data together when I was at Fayetteville School District back in 1995 through 2003. So I'm pretty familiar with how you can and can't use the information, but they're also new in the game of going back and going down to grade 3. So you have to keep in mind too that they're in a development process when it comes to linking the information from grade 3 on up. Okay. So even though the ACT itself is well established, you're really looking at a relatively new product. And I know there's a lot of discussion that we don't even have in this room around there are things about these tests that you would go in a regular RFP process, you would put out information that you would want the different vendors to respond to. And you would have that opportunity to get very specific responses that allow you to do, piece by piece comparisons. And that's where some of the questions that you all are asking really get answered at an in-depth level that help you to make those kind of decisions, is when you've got that competitive bidding piece coming in and you can really see those components to a structured framework of the questions you want them to answer. And so I think some of the things that everybody's been asking about really get answered so much more deeply and more technically to the extent that they inform some of the uses of the assessment, when you have a formal process where everybody's giving you those in-depth bids about that information, because that's where you get to hear about the difference between computer adaptive and where they are with the different types of scaling and how the different tests are going to support growth scores. There's so many different implications that come with the selection of an assessment that an RFP process really helps you to lay out. So, and I can't help but think about that as you guys are talking about this.
Yeah, because I'd like to ask you a question anyway, Dr. Phelps, so you go ahead and add something, though.
Well, my reading of the research on test coaching convinces me that no, that all these claims about test coaching for the ACT and SAT, it really doesn't work. If you're teaching the subject material, that's a good thing. But if you're teaching tricks on how to solve, how to trick multiple choice tests like always answer B, I just don't agree with that.
You don't agree with that at all?
No, and I think the strengths of the traditional multiple choice tests, in my opinion, outweigh a lot of the new fancy stuff that some educators want to impose on us, like explain your answer. I think explaining your answer just slows everything down. I think it's a really bad idea.
But you're probably opposed to that constructive type of...
No, I like a mix.
Okay. Last question. I got time for one more question?
You may be here alone, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I won't. Thank y'all for coming. I really appreciate everything you've done. Thank you.
You can ask it. Thank you, Hope. Thank you, Mr. Davis. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Dr. Phelps. Thank you, Dr. Airola. Appreciate it very much. It was an excellent day, another excellent day. This is now 32 hours of hearing, testimony, something like that. And we'll talk next week.